Okay, so now I've talked about the first third of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and now we turn to the middle section. Now, the theme of Metamorphosis, that is transformation, obviously continues through the middle section. You have stories, for instance, of Mira, her incest with her father, the story of Byblis, her incestuous love for her brother Caunus, and her eventual transformation. You have the story of Midas, who is granted the golden touch by Bacchus and ends up regretting it, and then actually ends up with donkey's ears because he doesn't judge accurately between Apollo and Pan, and so forth. So what we now get is, though, a shift in tenor away from the simple punishment of somebody does something wrong and then gets punished to a deeper examination of what types of consequences occur in human relations before the actual transformation happens. So you may remember there's an extensive narrative in Book 9 about Byblis and Caunus especially. Byblis happens to be the word from Greek and Latin for the bark of a tree, and it's the word that gives us all the book-related words like Bible and bibliophile and so forth. And Caunus is the reed that's used to write with. So the original plant that then gives us the thin stalk that can eventually be converted into a pen for writing. So Byblis and Caunus are brother and sister with a rather unusual pair of names. And it turns out that Byblis, the girl, has an inappropriate love for her brother Caunus. At one point, she looks upon Caunus and wishes very badly that she were in fact somebody else other than his sister, and she desperately wishes to be referred to as a girl rather than specifically as his sister. So Byblis ends up taking a rather unusual response to her difficulty, which is somewhat similar to what happens in Euripides' Hippolytus with Hippolytus' stepmother Phaedra, the wife of King Theseus of Athens. Phaedra ends up writing a letter in which she accuses Hippolytus to his father Theseus. We discussed this in the earlier video of Ovid's Heroides before the midterm exam, and when we read the Ovid's Heroides on Phaedra's letter to Hippolytus. And in that one, of course, we remember how Phaedra said, well, I'm going to write a letter. What harm could a letter possibly do? So it's interesting to see how letter writing is put into the province of women, that if the women are literate enough, the way that they could potentially express themselves is through letter writing, and sometimes even in the composition of poetry, as we see in Greek literature with two Greek relatively rare women poets, Sappho and Corinna. And Sappho, of course, is the one who is better known to us because her work is more preserved. So you have Ovid, who picks up on the tradition of letter writing from women who are dealing with a difficult love circumstance or have any other topic that they would like to compose a written document concerning. And so Byblis in this case responds to her incestuous love for Caunus by writing a letter to him on tablets. When she tries to hand them over to a messenger, however, she gets nervous and she drops them, and that's regarded as a bad omen. In the same way that Hippolytus rejects the advance of Phaedra from the Heroides, similarly, Caunus ends up just as inflamed by her sister's inappropriate love for him, and he too rejects her advances. It therefore ends up quite tragic for Byblis. She's going to end up getting transferred himself into a tree whose bark can be used for the composition of books. And in fact, in Latin, the word liber, L-I-B-E-R, which gives us our word library in English, is originally a word for the bark of a tree before it comes to mean a book. So that's unfortunate in terms of the way that that particular relationship, unfortunately, was not at all appropriate to happen, and then ends up, in fact, turning out to be completely unworkable. All right, now, the real point that should be distinguished with this story from some of the earlier stories is that there is a great deal more attention on the consequences that are going to torture the victim of the unfortunate circumstance the victim falls in before, as we say, the victim is finally released by the transformation. We do actually see some of that with Apollo's lengthy pursuit of Daphne, with Narcissus's lengthy lament as he stares at himself in the water and realizes that he's fallen in love with himself and cannot get relieved of the love that he feels. So Ovid's very lengthy psychological explanation of what someone goes through once they have become victimized by one of these irrevocable circumstances is really quite fascinating to watch. Ovid really doesn't get too focused on the crime and punishment aspect of somebody does something wrong and then is quickly punished. That obviously does lie in the background. The moral lesson that one must learn from each person's mistake is clearly vital, especially in the context of the nascent Roman Empire. However, Ovid also, in the tradition of his elegiac works earlier, is really interested in the psychology of someone who is in distress and the way that that person will handle that particular distressing circumstance that they're in, often not too well. So it's for this reason that the story takes on an extra dimension. You have the original difficulty that's presented, but what really interests Ovid is how does that person respond to it? In fact, this is a tradition you can find with Greek tragedy. In many cases, the characters, especially when they're in conversation, are trying to work out what is going on around them and how they, in fact, should respond to what is happening around them in order to try to come up with an appropriate response. Obviously, in tragedy, the response that's taken often ends up being the wrong one, and the tragedy that results is the consequence of human error or blindness at heart, some type of moral lapse that occurs in one's judgment that causes one to select a wrong way of proceeding and then come out with a bad result. So as you examine the particular stories of, as we say, Biblis and Caunus, of Myrrha, of Midas, with Midas in the touch, what you see, therefore, is what's now happening with the particular human frailties that come up as the humans start to evolve and try to interact with the world around them and have a great deal of difficulty doing so. What is it that they're going to go through as this happens? Sometimes Ovid will make this rather comic, as in some of the details of Biblis' story. Sometimes he'll make them quite grotesque, as in Myrrha's story. But the general sense is that the humans have to struggle quite a bit in their difficulty and often cannot get out of it before finally they end up succumbing. Now, in rare cases, you can have a story that turns out well, as in the case of the elderly couple Philemon and Baucis. They are approached by the gods Jupiter and Mercury in disguise, and they take them in as guests and are prepared to offer practically everything they have, including even a goose that they try to unsuccessfully chase around to kill, in order to satisfy the needs of their guests, despite the fact that they have very little possessions of their own to really be able to offer. So eventually they are rewarded upon their deaths of turning into trees that interlock, and the point is that they will always be joined after their deaths in a close binding relationship, in this case a physical one, that will keep them together thereafter for eternity. So that's a positive example of the kind of moral behavior one should have. But as you'll see, there are not very many examples of that kind of positive behavior. In some cases, the punishment that is inflicted, even when it is gods involved, is all too human in the sense of how devastating the particular punishment is. And probably none more so than in the story of poor Niobe, the one who boasted that she had 14 children, 7 boys and 7 girls, that made her 7 times as successful as the childbirth goddess Latona, who is actually the Greek figure Leto, that is the mother of the 2 twins, Apollo and Artemis. Well, what unfortunately Niobe didn't learn until too late is, first of all, not only should you not insult gods in general, but it's very possible that Latona really doesn't have all that many children. But it happens that these 2 children, Apollo and Artemis, are the world's best archers. So getting them angry results in arrows flying, and usually when that happens and they're angry, people close to you die. Nobody didn't figure that out, unfortunately. So there actually are several tragedies that we know of in ancient Greek literature discussing the story of Niobe. Regrettably, none of them have survived, but we know definitely of one by Aeschylus, in which apparently the veiled figure of Niobe remained on stage for a relatively long time, not speaking to the audience or to anybody else on stage. So Niobe witnesses the devastating destruction of all 14 of her children. She even flings herself on top of the youngest girl, trying to save her after everybody else has died. But the arrow comes through unerringly, and finally that last girl is cut down. Niobe ends up going into a state of perennial mourning, and finally she ends up collapsing into a heap of a person who's simply mourning and mourning and mourning without end, and finally she gets petrified, turns into a stone that is continuously dripping tears all the time, so that eventually that's all that's left of her is the stone. And apparently there is a description of a stone that really did exist that was letting off moisture all the time, and so this is an etiological explanation for why that stone is there. So in essence, therefore, the difficulties that come up with humans don't simply relate to the gods. Those are the earlier stories back in the first section. The difficulties that the humans run into here now are more about how humans misrelate to each other and therefore suffer related consequences, similar ones in terms of the divine wrath and the transformation that results, but also can cause harm, either emotional or physical, to each other. Again, as in the case of Byblis, trying to pursue a different kind of relationship with her brother Countess, and thereby essentially rupturing the close relationship that she and her brother had previously before she started in on this essentially out of line passion that she had for him. So as we go through these stories, as we talked about in the previous video, we have a sense of errors and mistakes that are being weeded out of the system, so that by the time we get to the point when Rome is going to be founded, starting in book 12, we have a sense that proper behavior is finally going to prevail because all the previous mistakes have been eliminated. And of course, the proper behavior will start off with the figure of Aeneas as he travels from Troy to Italy, much as we witnessed in Virgil's Aeneid. So we'll come back for our final of our three-part series on Ovid's Metamorphoses, and we will look at the conclusion of the work, books 12 through 15, as we see the beginnings of the world of Rome, and then gradually leading through the Republic, and finally the Empire. Okay, come on back, and we will conclude Ovid's Metamorphoses.